When I was younger, about 10 to 11, I lived out west, past MTISAQLD, I'm now 19. During my time out there I had some extremely strange encounters with something similar to what skinwalkers are described to be. I saw a creature, about the size of a small horse, completely black, had no tail, no ears, a face like a dog/horse. When it would appear everything would become still and quiet, all animals would disappear, and if I were on/near a horse it would be terrified. Looking at it made your skin crawl in fear and tingle. It felt like leaning over an abyss, looking at death. It never made a noise when I saw it. The closest it ever got to me was within 10 meters, in broad daylight. I spoke to some of the Aboriginal elders and they told me it was a very evil spirit, and as it hadn't attacked me in any of my encounters with it, it was either protecting me or was wary/afraid of me. I just wanted to share my experience and know if anyone else has experienced anything similar. Big Bear CA Possible Skinwalker Story 2020. Hi all. Take this experience as you will. I was taking engagement photos with my fiancé out in Big Bear, California. We were staying out in a cheap place near the forest called the Goldmine Lodge, good for broke young couples. We were staying the weekend and we had friends come along with us staying in another cottage. First day was fun and exciting, lots of quality time with my fiancé. I listen to lots of creepypasta as I sleep, so I'm familiar with skinwalkers and other cryptids. Throughout the day I would joke with my fiancé about skinwalkers and stuff. She has had experiences with supernatural stuff, maybe I was a little mean with my jokes lol. Do I believe in skinwalkers? Possibly to an extent. I think there are some things on this earth you shouldn't fuck with. It's still part of my personality to joke about things though, haha. The incident happened on the second night of our trip. Around 2 a.m. I woke up, which is typically normal for me, but I heard this weird howling noise. It sounded like no animal I have ever heard. At first I thought I was dreaming, but I heard the howling again. My fiancée was also up and she called out my name quietly. She said, "What's that?" I'm scared. Then dogs in our lodge, Goldmine Lodge is pet friendly, yay, all started going crazy and barking. I told my fiancé to pay any attention to it and we hugged each other. The howling continued for another few minutes or so, then stopped along with the dogs barking. We did not sleep well that next morning. Strangely enough, my fiancé was saying she heard her mother's voice calling for her last night as well. I'm glad I told her to not pay any attention to it. It does no good to give a skinwalker attention or let it in. That I know from skinwalker stories. Let me know what y'all think. Definitely something new to me. My curious self kinda wants to go back. The time a bunch of stray dogs might have killed a skinwalker. So this is a story from my brother. As such I have no way of validating that this happened at all except one part that I'll get to later. So back in 2015 my brother worked for a security guard hiring place, not exactly sure what to call it. Basically he'd call and they'd station him someplace or another that needed it. So this particular time my brother got hired by the local cemetery. They'd had issues with kids sneaking in at night and messing things up, and at one point, they even broke a couple graves. Anyways, his job was just to drive around the cemetery and make sure no one was messing around. This area was pretty rural and at the time, had a pretty bad stray dog problem. Dogs would get lost or people would drop them and they'd form packs and roam the countryside. On this particular night, my brother was at the cemetery and noticed a pretty big pack of dogs, about 8 or so, just wandering around and playing. There was a big Rottweiler, important later, a couple of mixed breed dogs and even a little Bichon Frise that was clearly someone's pet at some point because it still had a harness on. Also important later. So my brother is doing his rounds, which, like I said, was basically to drive from one end of the cemetery to the other with a spotlight and make sure no kids were breaking things or banging in one of the mausoleums or something. He's driving real slow and has the window down, his arm out the window with the spotlight, and it's pitch black at this point. Suddenly he hears the dogs going crazy and then he hears, what he best described as a sound that sounded like that screaming bird from the swamp episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender cartoon, but deeper and more human, with a rattling sound mixed in kind like a rattlesnake's rattle. The dogs go silent before starting back up barking and snarling a few minutes later. Then something fast and pale runs in front of his headlights with the 8 dogs in pursuit, barking and snarling. So he decides to follow the dogs in fear that they're getting ready to tear someone's pet to pieces. He parks his car, gets out with his spotlight, then follows the sound of barking before he hears that scream again and swears that he heard a faint heel mixed in with the weird screech and rattling. He gets to where the dogs are going nuts and shines his light at the spot and is surprised to see that the dogs have a deer backed up against the wall of a mausoleum. He said that this deer was a pale gray color, it was skinny and emaciated, and then he shines the light on its eyes. They're black, he says, but no light reflects from them and no shine either, they look like the eyes of something dead. He is understandably confused, and he's standing there, a few yards away from a pack of angry, snarling dogs that haven't even registered that he's there. The dogs have this deer surrounded and are taking turns nipping at his hind end and legs, but my brother notices that every time they do, they recoil and sort of gag, as if the taste is appalling to them. My brother then hears a deep growling from behind him, and this big Rottweiler bowls past him, launches itself at this deer, grabs its hind leg and with a mighty shake, knocks the thing over and just starts wailing on it, and then he says the deer lets out that screech again. It then takes its hoof and swipes, yes, he said swipes, at the dog. The dog lets go and the thing takes off, dog's hard on its heels. He never did guard work at that cemetery again, but he did go back a few days later and managed to get the little Bichon Frise to come to him. He's had that dog for the last 5 years. North Carolina incident. This happened to me in January of 2019 in western North Carolina, around the small town of Silva. I was participating in a week-long program to get certified as a first responder for wilderness first aid and rescue. I am studying to become a forester, and it is important to know how to keep people alive in the woods when things go wrong. There are 2 primary locations in the complex, a classroom with some bathrooms and a kitchen where we spent most of the day in class and ate meals, and a group of 1-room cabins on top of a steep hill directly north of the classroom where we would sleep. An important thing to note about the cabins is the heating system. Each cabin has a small, but powerful, radiator in it that makes the cabin feel like a sauna if left on for too long. Since it was January in the Appalachians, it was pretty chilly outside at night, so the heat was needed. In order to strike a balance between boiling in our beds and getting hypothermia, we would turn on the radiator and leave a window open so that warm and cold air could circulate and create a reasonable temperature. Don't get at me about the waste of power, I didn't like it either. The radiator and the open window were at the front of the cabin, next to the door, and my bed was directly across from the window. The incident happened on the 5th day, a Thursday, of my time there. My boyfriend and I, who was enrolled in the program with me, had settled down for the night in the cabin we shared with one other person. We had gone to sleep as normal and were sleeping soundly on 2 bunks that we had pushed together so we could sleep next to each other. Sometime during the night, I was woken up by some shuffling on the other side of the room near the window. I heard my boyfriend say in a complaining voice, "Can't we close this window?" I wake up feeling frozen. I woke up more and sat up in my bed groggily, about to answer him, when I heard another voice say, "If we close the window, it'll get too hot and we'll wake up sweaty." I snapped awake and froze where I was sitting. The voice that had responded was my voice. There is something very strange and wrong in hearing your voice repeated back at you. In the dark, I looked down next to me where I saw my boyfriend sleeping soundly. At this point, a mortal dread had a tight grip on my chest and I forced myself to not move or even blink. I was focused intently on the place near the window, fearfully anticipating more of my own words. I heard more shuffling outside the window and my same words were repeated, "If we close the window, it'll get too hot and we'll wake up sweaty," followed quickly by my boyfriend's voice again, "Can't we close this window?" I wake up feeling frozen. Towards the end of the last repetition of my boyfriend's words, there seemed to be an unevenness in the enunciation, like raising and lowering the pitch slightly. I remained frozen in my bed, feeling my hand fall asleep in my propped-up position. I sat there for what felt like 15 or 20 minutes, listening to whatever it was shuffle around in front of our window, separated from me by some odd 10 feet in window mesh. Eventually, the shuffling became more frequent, and a weird mumbling sound came from outside the window, with no real words being said, or none that I could make out. This particular behavior didn't last long before the shuffling sound moved to the left of the window to the door, where a scratching sound began to manifest. As the sound moved, I saw the silhouette of a medium height, 5'6", figure that moved in an uncanny way, like when a baby animal tries to walk for the first time but isn't quite strong enough to stand up correctly. It sounded like someone was scraping some dry sticks against the wood of the door, not aggressively, but kind of like an impatient dog asking to be let in. This scratching slowly moved around the cabin, stopping when it reached the wall that I was closest to. My ears were strained to hear anything that might indicate further action, but all I could hear were footsteps on the dry leaves. The footsteps eventually moved away from the cabin and down the other side of the hill and didn't return for the rest of the night. I stayed unmoving from my position for at least another half-hour before my body readjusted itself slightly, letting blood flow back into my asleep limbs. I was wide awake until my boyfriend's and other roommates' alarms went off sometime before dawn to get ready for the day, which felt like maybe 2 hours, but I couldn't be certain because I didn't have a clock. My boyfriend was surprised that I was awake before him, as I am typically a later sleeper, but I just told him his alarm woke me up and tried to act somewhat normally. We got up and got ready for our day, but I refused to leave the cabin until the sun began to peek over the mountains. For the rest of the week I was on edge and felt like there were eyes on me whenever it was relatively dark out, though I am not sure how much of that was raw paranoia. In the day following the incident at night, I had realized the lines that were repeated to me by the voice were a part of a conversation that my boyfriend and I had had earlier in the week, and I came to the conclusion that whatever it was had been outside our cabin and heard us talking. This scared me a great deal, as I also realized that it had likely been lurking there in the following nights as well without us realizing it, and might do so again for our remaining nights, though it ended up not coming back. I waited to tell my boyfriend about this until we had left the program because he scares easy and was already a little wary of walking in the woods at night up to the cabins. It should be noted that I know this to not be a sleep paralysis experience, as I have had them before and they were nothing like this, not to mention I was able to move. I am posting this here also as a means of asking for advice in addition to getting it off my chest, as this winter I will have to return to the same location to renew my certification. Expires 2 years after acquisition, and I want to know as much as I can so I can hopefully avoid another encounter. I know the entity for which this board is named is pinned on a lot of strange encounters, but I don't have a better idea of what it could be. If there is a similar entity that exists in my area, I'd be glad to hear about it and what I can do, if anything, to avoid it.